Hi, today I'd like to speak with you about decision making and reasoning. I'd like to focus especially on some of the common biases that we find in human thinking. One of the biases that's very common is called illusory correlation. This is when we assume a relationship between contiguous events. In other words, two things occur around the same time, and we assume that they go together and that they're correlated with each other. There's a Latin phrase called post hoc ergo propter hoc, right, which means that because something follows something else, therefore it must have been caused by that thing. So that's a version of this kind of illusory correlation. Often this is based on a misleading subset of the available evidence. So we don't see all the evidence, we only see a part of it, and based on that partial evidence, we jump to a conclusion that would not be warranted if we had all the evidence. We see this sometimes in superstition, where, for example, let's say a baseball player is wearing a pair of socks and he hits a home run. And so he then starts to think, well, that's his lucky pair of socks. And the next time he goes to play, he wears the same pair of socks. And if he hits another home run, then you can be pretty sure that he's going to wear those socks pretty much every time he goes out to play baseball. We see this in other areas as well. And in fact, even pigeons show evidence of this kind of superstitious behavior based on illusory correlations. And so this is a very common fallacy that many people make. A related error is called the fundamental attribution error. And in this error, we assume that somebody's behavior is based on their personality rather than their circumstances. For example, let's say you go to a bank and you wait online. When you finally get to the clerk is very rude to you. One of the temptations to jump to the conclusion that that clerk must be a jerk, or there must be something wrong with that clerk, there's basically it's a factor of their personality. What we often don't think is that perhaps there's something else that happened that caused the clerk to behave that way. It's possible, for example, that maybe the clerk just had an argument with his or her peers or with a supervisor, or maybe the client before you was very rude and the clerk was still kind of upset by that. Or maybe they didn't get enough sleep, or they're hungry, or there are all kinds of possibilities. But a lot of times when somebody behaves inappropriately or rudely to us, especially if we don't know that person, we jump to the conclusion that they're just jerks. That's their personality, and there's something they can do about it, right? And so that's a way of forming an assumption that may not be accurate, because it just may be that this person only behaved that way this one time and normally does not behave that way. But because we don't have all the evidence, right, then we are not able to form a comprehensive conclusion. On the other hand, if it's somebody that we've encountered many times before, and this one time they were rude, then you would know that that's not normal for that person, and you might not jump to the same conclusion. However, there is more recent evidence suggesting that the way we handle the fundamental attribution error depends on whether the person is somebody we like or don't like, or whether they're a member of the in-group or the out-group. And what I mean by that is when we like somebody or some group, then we're biased in favor of their behavior. In other words, we tend to interpret their behavior in a positive way. And when we don't like somebody, we're biased against them, so that we interpret their behavior in a negative way, even if it's the same behavior that the other person that's a member of the desired group or liked group shows. And so this then is something that doesn't get enough attention, but it shows how our reasoning is influenced by our emotions. Right? It turns out that, again, when we like people, we tend to interpret their behaviors in positive ways. When we don't like people, we tend to interpret the same behaviors in negative ways. Right? And so again, that's a sort of bias in the fundamental attribution error. Some people refer to it as the positive fundamental attribution bias when we're interpreting the behavior of people we like, and a negative fundamental attribution bias when we're interpreting the behavior of people we don't like. And so perhaps you can think of examples of this. Right? I know there are times when, for example, if my wife is angry at me, I'll say something nice, like, I love you, and she'll say, right, and she'll be skeptical, and she'll say, I don't want to hear it, I don't want to talk to you, so that whatever I say, she's not going to believe, she's not going to accept, she's going to be very sort of negative in terms of whatever I'm saying, because she's in a bad mood, because she doesn't like me at that moment. So it's a very common kind of error. But again, it shows how emotions influence our reasoning, right? So that our reasoning is not purely logical, right? Our reasoning is influenced by parts of the brain that in fact are more ancient than the prefrontal cortex, right? So that the emotional parts of the brain were there first in terms of evolution. I remember we talked about this earlier when we talked about Joseph Ledoux's work. And remember I talked about how Ledoux found that information may go to the limbic system, or the emotional system of the brain, before it reaches conscious awareness. And so by the time the information reaches conscious awareness, we may already have begun an emotional reaction to that information. Right? And so again, that shows that there's a relationship between our emotions and our thinking. And again, that we're not just purely logical creatures, we're psychological creatures. Also, I think I mentioned before that our emotions have the ability to hijack our reasoning, so that if we have an extreme emotion, whatever happens at that moment, we're going to interpret it perhaps in an extreme way. If we are in great fear, for example, we know that thinking tends to be impaired, right? Or sometimes when students take an exam, if they panic, they forget the answers, right? And so their ability to think logically and reasonably is impaired. And it's kind of funny because when they're taking the exam and they see a question, a lot of times they recognize the question, and they know they recognize the answer because they studied that, but they don't remember what the answer is, right? Or they think they should know it, but then they start thinking about all kinds of negative things that may cause them to become more anxious. And of course, the more anxious they become, the harder it is for them to think clearly and then rationally. And so we find that strong emotions often provide an impediment to clear logical thinking. But on the other hand, this emotional influence has the ability to enable us to believe what we wish to be true. So that if we want something to be true, right, if we don't like somebody and we want to think they're bad people, right, or we want to think that they've done something wrong, right, then we can twist logic in such a way that it supports a negative conclusion about their behavior. Even if it's something that we would interpret in a positive way if it was done by somebody we like. For example, in my book, I talk about approval mode and disapproval mode in chapter 5. Right? And so we see this in politics, where if a certain politician engages in deviant behavior, then a lot of people would say, well, that politician is therefore disqualified. You may remember in past years, if a politician, for example, was caught being unfaithful to his or her spouse, that politician would often resign, right? Or if the politician was found to have engaged in inappropriate sexual advances to people or harassment, the politician would often resign. But then if it's somebody that you like, then instead of saying that person should resign, you might say, oh, well, he's only human, right? Or she's only human, and nobody's perfect. And so we find a way to forgive that person because we like them, because we want them to be voted into office. So here we find that a behavior that would disqualify one person that we don't like might be used to really kind of not influence our decision about somebody we do like. Or we might even say, well, that proves that he's a real human being. He's not claiming to be perfect like all those other fake politicians. This is a genuine person. And so it just again shows how our biases can influence how we interpret evidence. One of the benefits of college that I really appreciate is that it helps us learn how to deal with these kinds of biases to some extent. Not only these, but some that I'll talk about in a little while. So that in college, for example, when you write papers, one of the things that professors constantly ask you to do is to support your claims with evidence. And so here we'll see that it's not enough just to make a claim, you need to find some way to demonstrate that it's true. And so this helps people avoid wishful thinking or just coming up with things that are not true. Now, having said that, I also know that there are certain politicians, I'm not going to name names, who will perhaps contest the result of an election and claim that there was something wrong because they didn't win. And so then they'll go out and maybe start legal cases trying to overturn the results of the election because they're going to say that there's something wrong. And of course, the courts and the judges are going to say, well, provide evidence, show what's the evidence that shows that you're being cheated against. And what we hear coming out of some of these people as well, just give us some time, we'll find the evidence. Right? Now it's been about a month. They still haven't found any evidence, but they're still claiming that the elections are fraudulent and they are being cheated against. Right? And so it's very common to have people engaged in wishful thinking, right, where they'll say what they want to be true or make claims that they want to be true, even if the evidence doesn't support that. right? But by using these kinds of arguments, they can claim, well, there's a relationship there, and therefore, there's a bias against me, or you should like me, or whatever it is. So in college, again, we learn to appreciate the importance of evidence and providing appropriate evidence to support our claims. Now, having said that, there's another bias that Sternberg and Sternberg also don't talk about, and at least not in this chapter, and that is what we call biased assimilation. Biased assimilation is the tendency to interpret evidence that supports our beliefs in a more positive way than evidence that contradicts our beliefs. In other words, when we believe something to be true and we encounter evidence that contradicts that, sometimes we will find ways not to accept the evidence. For example, sometimes I'll ask my students, how many senses do we have? And most students will say, oh, we have 5 senses. And I'll say, no, in reality, we have at least 24 to maybe 26 senses. And some students will react by saying, well, but you're just kind of using word games. The senses you're talking about are really just, the other senses that we've always used, where we talk about them in a different way. So, for example, if I say, well, we have vision, but within vision, we have color vision, right? And we have, maybe a sense of frequency, or we have brightness and brightness contrast, right? So these are maybe different senses that we have. And some students might say, well, that's all part of vision, so that's still one sense. And so it's not until you start mentioning other things, like maybe a sense of balance, or a sense of temperature, or the ability to detect electricity, or ability to detect pheromones, that they'll start to acknowledge that maybe we do have other abilities than the senses that we normally talk about. And so we find that we accept confirming evidence readily, but we reject disconfirming evidence. There was a fascinating study done by Batson some years ago, where Batson was working with people who believed in Jesus Christ. And what he did was he prepared a story that disconfirmed the existence of Jesus Christ. And he told participants in his study that the New York Times was thinking about publishing this article, but they weren't sure if they should because it was so controversial. And basically the article just said that Jesus Christ was a sham, that some people who lived around that time made him up because they wanted to exert a certain kind of influence on the politics of the day, or something like that. And so it seemed like a credible story, and they had the people that believed in Jesus Christ read this, and the people that didn't believe in Jesus Christ read this. And then they asked the people what they thought of the story. And they found that a lot of the people that believed in Jesus Christ, who believed the story, argued that it made them believe in Jesus Christ even more firmly. On the other hand, people that didn't believe in Jesus Christ said that it only confirmed what they already believed, right? And so you find that in this case, people are interpreting the evidence in very different ways, and in each case in ways that they use to support their claims. Another study was done by Plough, and this study was looking at people who were either in favor of or opposed to using nuclear energy. And so there was an incident at 3 Mile Island many years ago where there was a near meltdown of a nuclear reactor in the United States. And so soon after that, Plough went to these experts and asked them what they thought about the safety of nuclear energy in light of what happened at 3 Mile Island. And what happened was that those experts who were in favor of using nuclear energy argued that the incident at 3 Mile Island shows that nuclear energy is safe because the safeguards worked, and therefore we should continue using nuclear energy. On the other hand, the experts who were opposed to using nuclear energy argued that we nearly had a catastrophe. We came too close for comfort, and that the incident at 3 Mile Island suggests that we should not use nuclear energy because it's too dangerous. And so here you find that experts who had different opinions before the evidence was presented use the same evidence to come to opposite conclusions. And so this then raises an interesting issue, because on the one hand, in college and elsewhere, we say that if you want to make a claim, then you support your claim with evidence. But here we find a troublesome problem, because the same piece of evidence can be used to support different claims, and in this case has been used to support opposite claims. And so that's a problem, right? It means that evidence by itself is not always the answer to everything, that people can accumulate evidence to support almost any argument they want, assuming it's there, or they can twist the facts in whatever way they want. And so we see this now, certainly in politics in the United States, We see a lot of this where certain politicians are taking evidence and twisting it to satisfy their own arguments, even if in doing so, they distort the evidence out of proportion, or even if doing so means that they have to take the evidence out of context or misrepresent the evidence. And so there are all kinds of issues with this that we should be concerned about and that you should look out for in your own reasoning. Another area that Sternberg and Sternberg talk about in this chapter is group decisions. In general, everything else being equal, group decisions tend to be better than individual decisions. Right? So part of the question is, what makes group decisions better? And there are many different reasons that they talk about in this book. For example, when you have groups where you have several people talk about a topic and trying to reach some kind of decision, you often find that they have more ideas, right? So that if one person has X number of ideas, then two people have X plus something number of ideas. So that, if I talk about something else, I'm talking about, biases in psychology, then I have certain ideas about that, but you have different ideas. And some of your ideas may be ideas I don't have. So that between you and I, we find that we have more ideas than either one of us alone. Right? And so the more ideas you have, the greater the possibility that you're going to find a good idea. Also, there's more information. Because there's more information, that means that we have more examples of what works. We have more examples of what doesn't work. We have more information about the limitations of the different options. And again, we know more options because of having more ideas available, so that can help as well. And then, of course, when you have groups, you have more perspectives. And this is a very strong and underestimated aspect of group decision-making. I've served on a lot of committees in my life, and I find that one of the things I like about committee work is that we have different perspectives. So that I might look at something from one point of view, but then somebody else in the committee might look at the same thing from a different point of view. And often that other point of view is different from mine and maybe supplements it or just sort of a different perspective where it's sort of like looking at the same reality from literally different points of view, right? Or imagine if you're looking at me from in front of me or from behind me, right? What you see is going to be different, right? And so that perspective that we have, whether physically or just in terms of psychological perspective, then is going to be correlated with different ways of seeing the world and seeing different things. We see this, for example, if you look at, say, psychodynamic theory, right, or psychoanalysis, or compare that to, say, information processing, or maybe the humanist perspective, right? So you have all these different points of view in psychology, each of which contributes something, right? And then, of course, there's also the biological perspective or a neuropsychological perspective, right? So each perspective sees the world, sees the mind, and thinking from a different point of view and adds something new that the other perspectives don't have. Right? So if you're looking at the brain, for example, you see the way the brain works, you look at the nervous system, you understand the different sort of neural centers in the brain and what the different parts of the brain do, right? Then when you're watching somebody engaged in a reasoning task, you can observe which parts of the brain are active. And by knowing what each part of the brain does, you can get a sense of what the person is doing as they're engaged in reasoning about some task. And so this is a perspective that's different from, say, the information processing perspective, right? Where you're looking at maybe how the person talks about a certain task, right? And where you ask them, what are you thinking about as you engage in that task? And they'll tell you, I'm thinking this, I'm thinking that, right? And so that's also a useful perspective. And ideally, the different perspectives should be correlated with each other because in this case, we're talking about maybe observing the same behavior from different points of view. And so each different perspective yields information that would be complementary to other points of view and gives us a fuller picture of what's going on. Also, when you have more people looking at some kind of a problem, that gives you a greater scrutiny of it. So that when I'm thinking about a problem, I might think about it for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever it is. But then if I have, let's say, 5 other people in a committee, each of them can think about it for 5 or 10 minutes or whatever amount of time they want, right? And that extra time thinking about it means that they might see something I don't see. Right? And so again, just like the different ideas and perspectives, when you have more people thinking about a problem, right, that gives you more opportunities to notice things and in particular, notice solutions. I think I mentioned earlier this semester that I was working on the bylaws for the psychology department. Right? And so one of the things that we could have done is to have me just draft the bylaws and try to say, okay, this is our new bylaws for the department. And we avoided doing that because we formed a committee called the Policy Committee, and the Policy Committee consists of several members of the faculty who then looked at the bylaws and offer their own points of view. Right? And take my word for it, I'm somebody who knows a lot about bylaws. Right? And so I've been on a number of committees in the college, like in the governance committee, for example, or the charter review committee, and I was part of the person who framed the bylaws for the College of Arts and Sciences, and not to mention the different organizations I've been on where I've worked with bylaws. I've even written bylaws for nonprofit organizations, and so I know something about it. But on the other hand, it turns out that there were other members of the committee who had insights that I hadn't thought about. Right? They noticed either details were maybe small errors that I hadn't noticed. Or there were other details that were more important, maybe larger errors that I hadn't noticed, or aspects of the department that we hadn't thought about, that maybe I took for granted that they hadn't taken for granted. And so, between myself and the different members of the committee, we came up with a lot of different insights about our bylaws, which we then incorporated into a final document, which we sent out then to the Senate Governance Committee. And now the Senate Governance Committee is a part of the Hunter Senate, and these are people who have the role of analyzing the bylaws from the different departments and maybe approving or disapproving them. And so now, they're looking at our bylaws, and I suspect they're going to find things that we might have missed ourselves in the psychology department. And so we'll take their feedback and we'll make even better bylaws than we would have without having that perspective, without their scrutiny. Right? So group decision making, again, tends to be better than individual decision making. However, that's not always true. There are some exceptions. For example, Sternberg and Sternberg talk about groupthink. Right? In groupthink, we find that people will reach a premature decision in order to reduce conflict or in order to be accepted. So that the idea is that there are certain norms of behavior, for example, and when we join a group, we may accept those norms of behavior because that's what everybody else does. Right? In groupthink, if several members of the group come to a decision, especially if they're more prestigious members or more senior members, then it's tempting for the other members to accept that and to move on. Now, on the one hand, we can say, well, given that this is a consensus being reached by the senior members, maybe that's a good thing. But part of the problem is that sometimes it's not the best decision. Sometimes it's a simple solution that overlooks important details. And sometimes you find that a younger member of the committee or department or the group that notices things that the elders didn't notice. And so this happens in many different ways. It also happens in the field of psychology more generally. We have certain established theories like behaviorism, and people look at that and say, well, this is the dominant theory in psychology, and everybody kind of goes along with that as a kind of groupthink, right? But then ideally somebody else comes along and says, well, wait a minute, there's a problem here because this theory doesn't really adequately address such and such a problem. And then a lot of times the older, more senior psychologists will say, well, you're only saying that because you're naive and you don't know better. But then if the younger scientists stick to their guns and pursue that, a lot of times they'll notice that there's something important there that was overlooked by the senior members or the dominant sort of paradigm in psychology. And so that then may cause a kind of revolution where we overthrow a famous theory or what was an important theory in order to replace it with a more powerful theory. Right? So this is part of how science works. But the challenge of that, or at least part of the challenge of that, is to overcome this kind of group thing where everybody else in your field is accepting something as true, and you are perhaps not sure for yourself, but you go along with it because everybody else is doing that. One of the other places we see this, where it actually can be dangerous, is in jury reasoning. Right? In jury reasoning, you find that sometimes you'll have members of a jury who are more outspoken than others. And there are other terms we can use, like maybe the loudmouths of the jury, where these are people who dominate the conversation and they assert themselves and they want to be right, and they sort of out-argue everybody else, or maybe not argue, but out-yell everybody else. So if you don't agree with them, they might insult you or maybe just raise their voice or seem to get upset. And so what some jurors may do is, in order not to upset that person, is just go along. Right? And the problem is that how loud you talk is not correlated with how right you are. Right? And so there are many cases where people who are wrong raise their voice and maybe become even passionate about their point of view, even though they're wrong. And so this is the problem, especially in jury reasoning, right, where somebody's life may be hanging in the balance. Right? If you have some criminal or somebody who's accused of being a criminal, and the jury is trying to decide if they're guilty or innocent, this person might go to jail or maybe even be put up for the death penalty if they're found guilty, even if they didn't commit the crime. And so in this case, the problem may be a kind of groupthink where the members of the jury have come to a conclusion prematurely, again, because of groupthink. Now, there are many different kinds of reasoning, and the text distinguishes between several of them, in particular between deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. And so I'm going to talk about these a little bit, but keep in mind there are many, many other kinds of reasoning. Just a few versions of these as we go through, but the textbook, not being a book on philosophy or argumentation, didn't have room for everything, and so we'll touch on a few of the important issues here. Deductive reasoning is often defined as the process by which we use generally accepted premises to deduce specific conclusions. So we start out with propositions, if you will, that are believed to be true, and from those we then draw specific conclusions, right? And so if we assume that the premises are true, then the conclusions must be true. And this is important because it means that deductive reasoning has potential to provide information in terms of conclusions that we can be very certain about. So if I argue that, I don't know, let's say, what's a good example of this? Hunter College only accepts the best students. And John is a student at Hunter College, therefore John must be one of the best students. Right? So if it's true that Hunter College only accepts the best students, and if it's true that John is a student at Hunter, therefore it must be true, I emphasize must be true, that John is a good student. Right? So again, it depends on the premises, we'll talk about more in a moment, but if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. Just logically, there's no other way around it. So again, that provides a very high degree of certainty that is very desirable when it comes to reasoning and making conclusions. However, an important issue here is what we refer to the deductive validity, right? Deductive validity refers to the validity of the argument, right? How valid is our argument that if A, then B, right? If something is true, therefore something else must be true. And again, if the premises are true, the conclusions must be true. But I want to emphasize if, right? If the premises are true. That is something that is a little bit more problematic than it seems, because sometimes people start out an argument with premises that may not be true. So I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. One example of this kind of deductive reasoning is conditioned reasoning. And this kind of reasoning focuses on if-then arguments. So for example, one might argue, if you study for an exam, then you'll get a good grade, right? You studied for the exam, therefore you should get a good grade, right? So again, if it's true, if you study for the exam, you're going to get a good grade. And if it's true that you studied, therefore it must be true that you're going to get a good grade, right? Another version of this is what's referred to as categorical reasoning, right? Or categorical argument. And here we may use a syllogism, right, to decide which category somebody belongs to or something belongs to. And so these involve drawing conclusions about the category that something belongs to based on the argument. So here, probably the most famous example of a categorical syllogism is the one about Socrates, right? Where it's argued all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Right? So if it is true that all men are mortal, and if it is true that Socrates is the man, therefore it must be true that Socrates is mortal. Right? There's no other logical conclusion. Now, notice again that the premises are really a key here. The premises must be true for the conclusions to be true. And if they're not true, then the conclusions may not be true. But notice also something interesting here, and that is that an argument can be logical but false. Right? An argument can be logical but false. Right? What do I mean here? If I believe that all men are immortal, and I assert that Socrates is a man, I can therefore conclude that Socrates is immortal. Now that argument is a logically valid argument. Now you might say, wait a minute, how can it be logically valid when the premise is that all men are immortal? Well, remember, if the premise is true, then the conclusion must be true. And so the logic lies in going from the premise to the conclusion. So in other words, the argument that all men are immortal may not be true, but if we start out with that argument as a premise and then go from there to argue that Socrates is a man, therefore the conclusion that he's immortal must be true. Right? So again, it's an argument that's a logical argument because it follows logically from the premises to the conclusion. Right? The problem here, of course, is that the premise is not true. And so what this shows us is that logic is a limited tool for finding truth. Right? It's not a perfect tool. One psychologist said that logic is a tool for hire that can be used to make claims that are true or not true. And so we find that people, even people that are insane, will try to use logical arguments to support their claims. Part of the big problem, though, is that a lot of times their assumptions are not logical. Also, you may find this with people that are racist, where somebody who's racist might say that members of XYZ group, whoever they're racist against, are genetically inferior. And John is a member of the XYZ group, therefore John is an inferior person. Right? So if the premise is true that members of that group are inferior, and it is true that John's a member of that group, therefore it's a logical conclusion that John is inferior. And we find that throughout the millennia, people have used that kind of reasoning to be biased against people they didn't like, right? To be racist against people they didn't like or groups they didn't like. And so they then argue, well, this is a logical argument, right? Because we're assuming that some group is inferior to begin with, and because somebody's a member of that group, therefore that seems to justify withholding resources or treating them inappropriately. For example, there are some people that believe that people they don't like are not human. Or when the Europeans were taking over America from the Indians, a lot of them said, well, the Indians are not even human. This is just some kind of animal. And for them, that justified treating them like animals and treating them very harshly. Or when people had slaves, they would argue that the slaves are not really human, and therefore we can treat them in inhuman ways. And so obviously the premises here are grossly false, right? It is not true that the Indians or slaves are inhuman. They are all human, and of course they all feel. But it's convenient to ignore that if you start with if you start with the premise that they're not human, right? And especially if you don't want to get into arguments about whether you're right or not in that assumption. Right? So they just start out with that assumption and then go on to engage in whatever racist behavior they want to, or whatever hateful behavior they want to. So keep in mind then that again, an argument can be logical and still be false. Another kind of reasoning that we find, that it's another kind of deductive reasoning, is hypothetical deductive reasoning. And here again, Sternberg and Sternberg don't really get into this kind of reasoning, at least not here, but it's a very important kind of reasoning, because here in hypothetical deductive reasoning, we look at the effects of one variable on another when all other variables are held constant. So again, hypothetical deductive reasoning consists of examining the effects of one variable on another when all other variables are held constant. Now here, the variable that is said to affect another variable is usually the independent variable, and the variable that being affected is called the dependent variable. Right? And so another way of saying this is that we look at the effects of an independent variable upon a dependent variable when all other variables are held constant. Now, this should sound familiar to you, right, for a few reasons. One is that it's the basis of Western science. It really is the underpinning of Western science. And you might remember earlier we talked about Piaget's theory. I said that for Piaget, this is the epitome of human reasoning. Right? He thought it was even more superior than many other kinds of argument or reasoning. And it is true that this kind of reasoning has been instrumental in significant advances in humanity. We have had significant breakthroughs in science, ever since, we've always had breakthroughs, obviously, but especially since around 1928, 1935, when the experimental design was formulated by Fisher, and this design has incorporated the hypothetical deductive approach. Notice here that the assumption is that you can hold all the other variables constant. Right? So let's say I want to find out, does shaking somebody's hand make them like you more than not shaking their hand? Right? Then we can set up a study where we meet a lot of people for the first time, and for half of those people we shake their hand, for the other half we don't shake their hands. Right? And everything else we do the same. Right? And then we ask them afterwards, well, how much do you like me? Do you like me more when I shook your hand or more when I didn't shake your hand? And you're going to find some result. Right? Part of the problem there, though, is that obviously there are other factors at work. And in science, we want to control those factors, but in reality, we cannot control all those factors. So for example, maybe it depends partly on your facial expression. Right? And so if you one day you get up on the wrong side of the bed, or you don't have enough sleep, and maybe you come across as being more miserable or less happy or less ebullient than other days, all those things can affect the results. Or if the person that you're meeting is tired, right? If that person is maybe under stress, or if they're hungry, there's just so many variables that are going on at once that we cannot control all of them. And so we try in science and in psychology to control as many variables as we can, especially those that we think are relevant. But the reality is that we can't control all of them. Still, hypothetical deductive reasoning is a very important kind of reasoning because it does provide a lot of benefits. Right? If we succeed in controlling at least some of the relevant variables, then we can learn more than if we didn't control any variables. So if I want to do an experiment to find out if people like me more when I shake their hands than when I don't, I can try to make sure that I do all test all the participants on the same day, and maybe even in the same place. And so in that way, I can make sure that my own behavior is not going to be affected that much from maybe 1 o'clock to 3 o'clock. Maybe we can take other factors into account, like how long has it been since I ate dinner or breakfast or whatever it is. So all those things can be controlled to some extent, and we can see how that independent variable then influences the outcome when everything else is being controlled, at least to the best of our ability. Some people say that this is really kind of a fallacious assumption in Western science, especially psychology, because we cannot control everything. And so some people talk about other things like ecological validity or reactance, which all may influence the way somebody reacts in an experiment. And so these are important factors, but I'm not going to go into them now. If you take a course in experimental psychology, we talk about that kind of stuff in that course. But for now, I just want to talk about how hypothetical deductive reasoning is a very important kind of reasoning that we find in Western science. Another related kind of reasoning that we find, especially in science, is inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning, unlike deductive reasoning, goes from specifics to general. So in other words, it seeks to generalize from specific examples to general patterns or principles. And so the idea is that when you see a specific example of something, and then you see another specific example of that thing, and then another, we want to be able to generalize so that we can have general principles or conclusions about that phenomenon. Now, why is this important? Well, it's especially important in Western science, where we want to be able to understand reality. We want to form, again, these general laws, so that if I want to know, for example, what makes people like you, that I can look at different things and just observe their behavior of different people and try to draw some kind of conclusions from that. We want to formulate laws and rules that can be true in many different situations, and so this is particularly valuable in Western science for that reason as well. But notice that we run into a problem here, because when we're going from a general premise to a specific conclusion, if the premises are true, then the conclusion logically must be true. But with inductive reasoning, we don't have that same certainty, because there's a risk of something here that you're not going to find as much or at all in deductive reasoning. And one of the best ways of illustrating this is by giving you the example of the claim that swans are white. Okay? So let's say I'm considering the possibility of assuming that all swans are white. And so in order to find out, what I might do is go to the local zoo. So let's say I go to the Central Park Zoo and see if they have swans there. And if I do, let's say they're white. And then I go to the Bronx Zoo and all the swans there are white. And I go to all the zoos in New York City and all the swans I see in all the zoos are white. Then I might be tempted to conclude that all swans are white because all the swans that I've seen, which might amount to maybe 15 or 20 swans or maybe 50 swans, they're all white. Right? And so the problem, of course, is that I haven't seen all swans, and there's always the possibility that some swans that I have not seen are not white. And so let's say I make this a task that I take up interest. I go to other zoos around the country. I go to as many zoos around the country as I can. And let's see, even more than that, I get all my friends and my family members and my students to go out and all go to every zoo you can find in the United States and even around the world. And so we take a year, we go all around the world examining every swan at every zoo we can find. And after that year, we get back and I ask everybody, did you ever see any swans that are not white? And everybody says, no, every swan I've seen was white. And so now we have, maybe hundreds of people who've looked at thousands, if not millions of swans, and then all the swans that everybody has seen are all white. And so now it's having to say, okay, now we conclude that all swans are white. Okay. What's the problem here? The problem is that we may not have seen swans that are not white that still exist. It was that they may be there, but we just didn't see them. For example, it's possible that, when I go to the zoo, that there was a swan there that was not white, but he flew away or she flew away yesterday, or maybe died yesterday, or maybe 5 minutes after I leave, a non-white swan is going to be born. Right? And so with inductive reasoning, there's always the possibility that you have not seen all of the possible evidence. Right? And in fact, it's not just a possibility, it's really usually reality. Just you almost never see all of the evidence, especially when you're trying to draw inferences about large groups of people. And so this is a problem. And how do we deal with that problem? One of the ways we deal with that is by saying, okay, you know what? It almost doesn't make any sense to try to see every possible example of every behavior that we're interested in, especially if we're interested in the behavior of large groups of people, or drawing inferences about all of humanity. So what we might do instead is to look for examples that contradict that behavior, or that assumption. So in terms of swans, instead of looking for swans that are white, we can look for swans that are not white. Because we can see a million swans that are white and still not be able to conclude that all swans are white. But we only have to see one swan that's not white to be able to conclude that not all swans are white. Right? And in fact, I know from experience, when I went to Aruba, I stayed in a hotel where they had black swans, right, and brown swans. Right? So having seen swans with my own eyes that were not white, I can now conclude that not all swans are white. Right? Or I would not conclude that all swans are white. Right? And so this has become really the modern way of looking at reality from a scientific perspective, because in a way it's a lot easier. Right? It's easier to find one swan that's not white, right, than to find a million swans that are white and know that I've missed some swans that might be not white. But notice a few things. One is that it really depends on empirical observation. Right? In other words, I have to observe reality with my own eyes, or with the eyes of people I trust, who can then bring back information about what they've observed. And so this can be an onerous process because of this risk of not encountering evidence that contradicts our beliefs or our theories that might actually be out there. The other place where you see this is in statistics. In modern statistics, those of you who've taken statistics probably know about probability, and you probably know about hypothesis testing, right? In hypothesis testing, you have a null hypothesis that you assume to be true, and you see if the evidence disconfirms that hypothesis. So if I believe all swans are white, then I'll go out and I can look at swans, and if every swan I see is white, then that confirms that hypothesis, right? But if I find one swan that's not, then that disconfirms that hypothesis, right? And so here we find that the assumption then is that everything is normal, everything is unchanged, one variable does not affect another variable, and that's null hypothesis. And then we collect evidence to the contrary. So, for example, we might assume that as a null hypothesis, if you shake somebody's hand, they're not going to like you any more than if you don't shake their hand. Then we could try doing a study where you shake half the people's hands that you meet for the first time and you don't shake the other half, and somebody asks them, how do they like you? And then you can see, now if you find that most of the people whose hands you shook said they like you, and most of the people whose hands you didn't shake say they don't like you, then that supports the alternative hypothesis and rejects the null hypothesis. And so in that situation, you would basically drop the null hypothesis as having been disconfirmed, and accept the alternative hypothesis as having been confirmed. So notice this process is really, really important. The basic assumption here in hypothesis testing then is that if you accumulate evidence that disconfirms the null hypothesis, then you reject the null hypothesis and you accept the alternative hypothesis. Now, based on what I've said, that probably sounds reasonable, but there's a flaw here at the very heart of Western science. And the flaw is that just because the evidence enables you to disconfirm the null hypothesis does not mean that it confirms the alternative hypothesis. In other words, using the example of shaking hands, we're asking people if they like you after they shook your hand, and the people that we're saying that people that shook your hand say they like you more than the ones who didn't shake your hand. And so we can understand how maybe we reject the null hypothesis, but we should be careful accepting the alternative hypothesis that it's the shaking hands that makes people like you more. Why? Because it's possible that when you were shaking somebody's hand and not when you didn't, you smiled. Right? So if every time I shook somebody's hand, I smiled unknowingly, unintentionally, but I did not smile when I didn't shake people's hands, then it may be that they're liking me more because I smiled and not because I shook their hand. Or maybe smiling when you shake somebody's hand make them like you more than if you don't smile when they shake their hand, right? Or if you, just have one of those. So you see the problem here. Just because you reject the null hypothesis doesn't prove that the alternative hypothesis is true. And yet, in Western science, we do this all the time. Right? We reject the null hypothesis and jump to the conclusion that therefore the alternative hypothesis must be true. Now, some experiments will set up maybe a study where they have multiple alternative hypotheses, where if you have one outcome, it shows one thing. If you have a different outcome, it shows something else, right? Or maybe they'll vary conditions. So they'll have a condition where you don't shake somebody's hand and smile, another condition where you shake somebody's hand and smile, another condition where you just smile. I'm sorry, so you do either one or both or the other. So again, let me rephrase that. You can have one condition where you don't shake anybody's hand, you don't smile. Another condition where you don't shake their hand, but you do smile. Another condition where you shake their hand, but don't smile. And a condition where you shake their hand and smile. So now you've got 4 different conditions, and you can just check how much people like you under each of those different conditions. And so that's a better test of the hypothesis than just doing one variable at a time. So a lot of modern studies will manipulate more than one independent variable to see how all the different variables being manipulated together influence the outcome. And that leads to more advanced designs like regression analyses or factor analyses that you'll probably hear about when you take experimental psychology or maybe statistics. So we find something interesting in Western science that on the one hand, we want to draw generalizations, we want to use inductive reasoning to draw conclusions, but on the other hand, it's not as certain as deductive reasoning, even though deductive reasoning isn't perfectly certain either. But on the other hand, we can figure out some things, have some ideas that are better than not having any information at all. Right? So we're better off having information that we collect or observing reality, and drawing inferences from that than drawing inferences without that evidence, right? Without any information to go on. So here, again, the focus on disconfirming hypothesis, right? So here, again, as I've said before, Western science seems to be moving forward by looking to disconfirm null hypotheses and maybe even disconfirm alternative hypotheses. Another kind of reasoning, and this is one that we've talked about before, is analogical reasoning. Right? In analogical reasoning, we reason in a way in which the characteristics of one domain are attributed to a different domain. And so the idea is that we try to find a parallel in the structure of a problem across different domains. So we use the example of the radiation problem. Remember that we talked about a person having a tumor and you want to use x-rays to get rid of the tumor, and we were trying to figure out, well, how can you do that? Because if you just shine one x-ray directly to the tumor, it might be so strong that it'll kill the tissue that has to go past. Right? And so when we talked about a military battle in which a general surrounded the town with his troops, then that provides a good analogy because we can then say, okay, with the X-ray example, instead of using one strong X-ray, you can use weaker X-rays and shine that from different points of view. Right? So you have many, many different X-rays coming from different perspectives, or from different angles, I should say, all converging on the same tumor. Right? And so even though the tissue would not be damaged in the area surrounding the tumor, because all the X-rays are converging there, the cumulative effect is going to be to hopefully kill the tumor. And so this is a very powerful way of reasoning. In fact, it's a very common way of reasoning because we find that a lot of times if we can't figure out the solution to a problem based on what we know about that domain, we might have knowledge in another domain that is useful. I talked about this before in terms of the benefit of a college education and the benefits of the core curriculum. Right? So that it may be that you don't have a solution to a problem in psychology, but maybe you took a course in physics that offers a analogous situation, right? Or maybe you took a course in chemistry where they have analogous situations. I might have given you this example before. If I have, I apologize for repeating myself. But Jean Piaget talked about the observation that reactions in the mind tend to follow the same course over and over again. And he called this homeoresis. Right? And so again, by homeoresis, he just meant that there are certain psychological processes that tend to reoccur every time certain circumstances occur. So for example, when you meet somebody new for the first time, you probably are interested in knowing certain things. So maybe you ask them, what do they do for a living? And maybe you ask them, what are their favorite books or foods or whatever it is that interests you. And in doing so, you then will find out what you want to know. And you may do the same process with each of any different people, so that that pattern of reasoning, which you're trying to find out certain things and priority to other things, might persist over time and across many different situations. And so this is what Piaget calls homeoresis. Now, when Piaget came up with this, he made the observation in psychology that we tend to reason in the same way over and over again under similar conditions. But there was no comparable phrase in psychology, so he borrowed a phrase from chemistry. We had a friend who's a chemist. He said in chemistry, there are certain chemical reactions that go along the same process every time, right? So every time you put two different chemicals together, they're going to react in pretty much the same way over and over again, no matter where you put them together. Or maybe it'll be different if you do that in space or something like that. But here on Earth, every time you put them together, you can have a similar reaction. And so Piaget argued that our thinking tends to be stable that way. So that again, whenever we are in a certain situation, we think along the same pathways or using the same methods. Okay. And so that's an example of an analogy where it seems to fit very effectively. So the thing is that you can use information from one domain to help you solve problems in another domain. There's just a couple of other points I want to make. And one of them is that a lot of these different approaches to solving problems or reasoning and making decisions are based on assumptions that are questionable. So for example, we talked about, we didn't really talk about it, but Bayes' theorem would be one example, where Bayes' theorem makes certain assumptions about reasoning, right? Or other theories that we talked about earlier that assume that the individual is omniscient. Remember we talked about economic man, right? And so that model assumes that we know more than we know. And so in that sense, it's not realistic. But also, for some of these models, like Bayes' theorem, require that we know everything there is to know about a problem before we find a solution, right? Before we form ideas about what is likely to occur or the probabilities that something's going to occur. That's a problem, right? Because obviously, we're never going to know everything about anything. No matter how much you study something, there's always going to be something you didn't study. There are people who dedicate their entire careers to studying one thing, and they still don't know everything. It took me more than 20 years to come up with all the ideas that I put in my book, and believe me, there's a lot of stuff that's not in there that I know that I just couldn't put in because it just didn't seem appropriate, or I couldn't find the right place for it. And there are a lot of things I don't know that I've learned after I wrote the book, and that I'm still learning. Even today, I'm learning new things that could have gone in the book, but they don't go in there because it's too late. And so, if you are somebody who's constantly growing, then you're going to find that you never know everything. But if you have an open mind, you can keep learning and therefore constantly improve your knowledge and better solve problems. But one of the sort of nasty little secrets in psychology is that humans tend to be cognitive misers. Cognitive misers are just people that don't like to think. And here, we see this in so many different ways. And probably the best example I can give you is my 8-year-old niece. Right? She gets homework assignments every weeknight, and she doesn't really want to do the homework. Right? She wants to watch TV. She wants to play, with her video, a video game, or she wants to do all kinds of other things except her homework. And so, there are a lot of people like that. Maybe some of you don't really want to do your homework. I don't want to do all the readings right away. And so it's a very common phenomenon, but it's often cited as an example of being a cognitive miser. In order to figure something out, a lot of us don't really want to do the work. I gave you the example before about toothpaste, right? How do you know that you have the best toothpaste? Right? And so in order to find out, you'd have to do a lot of research. And for most of us, it's just not worth the effort. We don't want to go through that trouble because it's not important enough. Right? And so this idea of being a cognitive miser is often expressed in psychology, but it's also perhaps a little bit misleading. Because it turns out that it's mostly true about things that we don't enjoy, right? About tasks that we don't enjoy. But it's not true, and probably the opposite is true with regard to tasks that we do enjoy. So on the one hand, maybe you don't enjoy thinking about your homework, but if you have a boyfriend or girlfriend, you probably do enjoy thinking about him or her, right? Or if you like psychology, you enjoy thinking about psychology. Whatever it is you enjoy, right? You probably spend a lot of time thinking about that. Or another example would be a hobby, right? If you have a favorite hobby that you've been doing for some time, that maybe you feel relaxed when you do it, or you enjoy solving the problems that are involved with it, then you do that a lot. And so the reality is that you may engage in a lot of thinking just day and night, over and over, just for hours and hours, thinking about something that you're interested in. And so the argument that we're cognitive misers is not entirely true because of that. On the other hand, if it's something you don't like, you may be a cognitive miser there. So I gave the example of homework, or maybe just something you don't want to think about. Maybe in my case, I like psychology, but I'm not really so crazy about chemistry. So I spend more time thinking about psychology than chemistry. And given an opportunity to think about chemistry, I'll probably pass it up. Right? And so one might argue that I'm a cognitive miser when it comes to chemistry. But even here, it's a little bit misleading because sometimes there are things that happen that are negative that require our attention, right? So if you get a splinter, right, you might not want to think about something negative. On the other hand, the splinter hurts, right? And so you're going to think about it. You're going to probably take action to get the splinter out and maybe provide appropriate medical treatment to the finger wherever you got the splinter. And so the reality is that while there's certain things we don't want to think about, and in that regard we're cognitive misers, we also think a lot about those things that are important to us. So the more important it is, whether in a positive or negative way, the more likely we are to think about that thing. And so that concludes what I want to speak with you about today. I hope you've gotten something positive out of this. And I would encourage you to go ahead and subscribe and like the channel that you're watching now. So again, I wish you a wonderful day and look forward to seeing you soon. Take care.